Hi, I'm Gary Yeagle. This is a seminar entitled A Biblical Response to Gender Confusion and Transgenderism. This is part one, Understanding Gender Theory. Before we get into the material, though, I really need to open up my heart to you and just talk about how we need to approach the subject of the LGBTQ world and life. And we need to do that with grace. We've got to come to the discussion with two things. Awareness that our own sins are worse than those in the LGBTQ world. And I'm serious about that. My sins, to whom much is given, much is required. And I come to this as a sinner with no need or intent to judge anybody else. The second thing is that we need to come to this topic with hearts that are weeping for those who are enslaved by this destructive lifestyle, even those who are advocating it. They are not the enemy. They are being held captive by the enemy. So we've got to begin with grace and love. But love can never be separated from truth. This episode presents some pretty hard truths, but here they are for you. Again, part one, Understanding Gender Theory. A mom named Eva was actually at a church luncheon when she received an email from her 12-year-old daughter, Grace. The email said, "Mom and Dad, I'm not actually a girl. My pronouns are they and them. I'm coming out today as transgender." And she was serious about that. Her parents really never saw this coming. For one thing, a few months earlier, Grace had posted on social media, "God created people, male and female." It looked like she was standing up to peer pressure. Also, it was surprising that Grace would have an issue with this topic because she was in a very strong family. Her mom and dad were together. They both loved each other. She had close relationships with her siblings. She was part of a strong Bible-believing church. And she was pretty sharp in the way she went about thinking about life. So she didn't seem to be somebody that could be taken in. But the third reason that her parents did not see this coming is that Grace's parents were naive about what has been taking place in the culture. For example, when it comes to the impact of the LGBTQ plus ideology going on in that culture on today's kids, when it comes to identifying as LGBTQ, notice this difference in age groups. Gen X, which is those born between 1965 and 1980, 1 in 20 have identified as LGBTQ plus, one version of that. Millennials, born between 1981 to 1996, that's that age character, that ratio is 1 in 10 who come out as identifying as LGBTQ plus. But for Gen Z, born from 1997, and Grace was part of this group, to 2013, that rate, by some studies, is down to 1 in 5. Well, what had actually happened to Grace? Well, at age 12, remember, that's her age, she began posting artwork with her friends to a social networking site called DeviantArt. At first, she was just posting her art along with her friends. But the gay is good message started to seep through. She also heard the term transgenderism for the first time. So she asked her mom about what that term meant. She had never really heard it before. Her mom courageously took a stand, but maybe didn't have the best answers. She said, "We just don't agree with that way of thinking." Would have been a little bit better to say, "What makes you say that?" and see if she could hear what's going on in her daughter's heart. Grace had the courage to post "God created people, male and female," as we mentioned before. She parroted her mom's answer in that situation. But in response to her posting that answer, that God created people, male and female, Her LGBTQ friends did not do what you might have expected. They did not shun her or shut her out. Instead, they opened their arms to her and invited her to the GSA Club, Gender Sexualities Alliance Club. The key theme of that group of girls getting together, 12 and 13-year-olds, was feeling uncomfortable in their bodies. And Grace did too. She says, looking back, "I believe strongly in modesty. I began to associate womanhood with being sexualized. I wasn't even really thinking male versus female, but non-sexual versus sexual." The messages that she heard at GSA Club radically changed her thinking. And by the way, something I forgot to mention is that 40% of millennials and Gen Z who identify as LGBTQ+ also identify as religious. Another reason why you would not have expected Grace to come out this way, but in reality, a high percentage of those who have religious backgrounds do. But back to the message that Grace was hearing about gender in her group, in the GSA group. Messages like, we all feel uncomfortable in our bodies. It's not cool to be a straight girl, or to be cis. That's old-fashioned. It's really, the heroes are those who are authentic, who are girls that really doubt their femininity and come out and say so. They hear that testosterone is a wonder drug that fills girls who take it with confidence. They hear the message, if your parents don't support you, it proves they hate you, so shut them out of your life. Grace had been taken captive by a false, destructive worldview, being promoted by, among other groups, a group entitled Transgender Student Educational Resources. They put out, this organization, a graphic intended to persuade children in elementary school of their worldview, a very fractured sexual personhood worldview. This graphic is a great description of the worldview that is having such an impact in the culture today. Let me take a moment or two to explain it, starting in the middle with sex assigned at birth. Of course, that we would call that biological sex. That's your anatomy, but this movement wants to change that to sex assigned at birth. And then this view of a person splits off their physical attraction, calling that sexual orientation, into male, female, that is heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual. Reading down to emotional attraction, this particular view of life separates sexuality from romantic desire, which leads to tremendous sexual abuse of women. And then moving to the top, what makes this view of life so distinct is the idea that you can separate gender identity from your anatomy and biology, and that's the gender identity part of this. And then from your gender identity come your gender expression, which is a term to describe your roles. At the heart of this gender image is really a separation of gender identity from the reality of your physical anatomy. And there is a historic origin of this concept that we can actually study, that we can identify. Again, this split between your identity, your mental perspective of yourself, and your biological sex, your anatomy, your physical body. And that is called, this theory is called gender theory. Until this came along in the 1950s, for 4,000 years, everybody understood that their gender was based on their anatomy. Who are the figures that shaped this movement? The first was a fellow named Magnus Hirschfeld. He was born in 1868 and lived into 1935. He was born in Prussia. He was a homosexual activist. He is known as the grandfather of the LGBTQ movement, and the primary reason for that is that he founded the World League for Sexual Reform, The League's purpose, liberation of the marital relationship from church domination, application of the knowledge of eugenics towards improvement of the race through birth selection, to free sex from being complicated by any sense of guilt. Shortly after medical school, he was a doctor, he began to explore gay subcultures and became the world's most prominent sexologist. The next figure in this movement was a man named Harry Benjamin. He was born in 1895, lived till 1986. He was born in Germany. He was an endocrinologist. He was a medical doctor. He was a close colleague of Magnus Hirschfeld. Though born in Germany, he relocated to New York City in the 1920s. He began to offer hormone treatments to cross-dressers. Again, that was his field, being an endocrinologist. He ended up writing the medical textbook, The Transsexual Phenomenon. He postulated and wrote that there are a spectrum of conditions requiring different treatments that ranged from hormone replacement therapy to surgical intervention. So he was the first one to begin to try to help people align their physical body with their desire to be another gender. The next figure is a man named Alfred Kinsey, who was born in 1894 in New Jersey, died in 1956. He was a homosexual sexologist who was known for hating his Methodist upbringing that he believed repressed his desires. He has been dubbed the father of the sexual revolution. He was a professor of zoology, in fact, and his specialty was wasps. His career as America's foremost sexologist began when he was asked to chair a committee to design a course on sexuality and marriage at Indiana University. This homosexual man asked to chair this course. Now, in a culture back in the 40s and 50s that considered homosexuality, bestiality, pedophilia, things like that, abnormal, he shocked his first college audience by walking in and saying, there are only 3 types of sexual abnormality: abstinence, celibacy, and delayed marriage. In other words, sex is happening all the time in all kinds of perverted ways by all kinds of people. He developed a scale of homosexual tendencies which is still being used today. His real impact, though, happened in 1948 when he published a bombshell of a book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. This was presented with Kinsey in lab coats and some of his partners, and pointing to charts and presented as very scientific, which basically argued that, again, all kinds of weird sexuality was taking place with people all the time. People just didn't know about it. Kinsey himself was a man, as you might suspect, who was very sexually broken. Even the New York Times wrote that Kinsey had affairs with men, encouraged open marriages among his staff, stimulated himself with urethral insertion and ropes, and filmed sex in his attic. He had an enormous impact on sexual morals in the 50s and 60s and 70s. However, his research was later proven to be completely fraudulent. And that was done by a woman named Judith Reisman, who exposed Alfred Kinsey's research as all a fraud, proving that the subjects of his research were not everyday Americans, but convicted sex offenders and pedophiles. And it gets worse. She exposed Alfred Kinsey's research team's sexual abuse of children in the name of research. She made public at a conference in Jerusalem in 1981 a chart that showed that Kinsey had put together. He believed that pre-adolescent children were sexual human beings whose sexual desires needed to be awakened and not suppressed by Judeo-Christian values. One of those tables that was presented in his research lists infants as young as 2 months old up to boys aged 14, noting how many orgasms they had. As Reisman pointed out, you cannot have that kind of data without either sexually abusing children or being complicit with those who were sexually abusing children. All of this is foundational for moving on to the father of gender theory, John Money. He was born in New Zealand in 1921, lived till 2006. He was raised in a home with an extremely abusive father, which seems linked to his own rejection of masculinity. In his own words, he said, "I suffered the guilt of being male. I wore the mark of man's vile sexuality." He was, though young at the time, was one of the core researchers at Kinsey's Institute of Sex Research. He has been called, I think rightly so, the father of gender theory. And here's why. He was a psychologist, not a medical doctor and not a biologist, but a psychologist who wrote his dissertation at Harvard entitled Hermaphroditism, an Inquiry into the Nature of Human Paradox. Hermaphroditism, which is called intersex today, is a birth disorder in which a child has parts of both male and female genitalia. Money's theory was that each of us is born a psychological hermaphrodite. Nature means nothing. Your body means nothing. Everything is about nurture, how you are raised, whether you are raised to be male or whether you're raised to be female. Again, he was not a biologist, but he was a psychologist. He formulated this theory in the 50s before we even knew as much as we know now about chromosomes and the fact that every chromosome in a normal female's body is marked XX, and every chromosome of the 30 trillion in the male body are marked XY. Money and his team chose the word gender as something psychologically distinguishable from biological sex. That was the process of coining this term. Mariam Grossman summarizes the idea that John Money introduced to the world and that he worked his entire life to promote is that when a baby is born, it is gender neutral. In 1961, Money was a part of a surgical team that conducted the first headline-grabbing sex change surgery at Johns Hopkins Medical School. In his book, The Adam Principle, John Money sought to justify pedophilia by distinguishing between pedophilic sadism and affectional pedophilia. But John Money made his fame through a pair of identical twins named Bruce and Brian Reimer. A botched circumcision procedure burnt off Bruce Reimer's penis. Bruce and Brian's parents happened to see John Money on TV, sort of a talk show back then, and they ended up contacting him, meeting him, being persuaded that they could basically convince Bruce that he was a girl. They gave him a name, Brenda, never told him what had happened. Money arranged for a team to castrate Bruce's testicles. They constructed a sort of vagina and started him on estrogen treatments. For 9 years, Money met regularly with Brian and Brenda and reported to medical journals that everything was going just as he had expected, that Brenda was a wonderfully happy, little masculine-oriented, little tomboyish, but very happy girl. But as the boys got older, they began to resist very, very strongly going to see John Money. They stopped going. Later, a documentary team met with them and found out the truth. First of all, Bruce immediately, when he was told that he had been a male, that he had a male body, asked to have his breasts that had been added surgically removed. He asked to be called David, not Bruce, because he felt like he was fighting a titanic battle like David and Goliath against these forces that were trying to make him feel that he was a girl when there was something wrong inside. For example, he was stealing his brother's trucks because he didn't want to play with dolls. He was peeing standing up. They also found out, this team, that John Money and his researchers were sexually abusing both of the twins. What happened to these boys as they grew up? Brian, who was sexually abused, as well as Bruce, Brenda, David, died of an overdose of antidepressants in his 30s. Bruce decided that he wanted to get married, had an artificial penis installed. This woman had 3 children, but at age 38, Bruce committed suicide. It's going too far to blame gender theory for that suicide. Suicide's a complex thing. But Bruce's parents blamed John Money, the sexual abuse. And what really happened was that gender theory brought so much pain into Bruce Reimer's life that he took it. He ended it. And gender theory is bringing pain into the lives of little girls and little boys all across America and the world today. Money's attempt to prove that the intersex condition, hermaphroditism, shows that gender is fluid failed. Disorders of the reproductive system do not prove the existence of more than 2 genders any more than disorders of the hearts and lungs prove there are 2 types of hearts and lungs. The intersex condition, the birth disorder, affects only 1 in 10,000. That means that if we were to consider my state, Maryland, and look at the 2022 statistics, 7 children would have been born with sexual abnormalities, and 68,493 would have been born with male or female genitalia. No rational person could look at those numbers and conclude that gender is anything other than binary. Money's 50-year-old theory has been repeatedly disproved by modern science. For example, embryology and biochemistry. We now know that at 8 weeks, in a boy baby that has an XY chromosome, the testes send out testosterone, which shapes the development of the brain and the rest of the child's development. At 8 weeks, the field of embryology. In the field of endocrinology, we now have a much better understanding than John Money had back in the 70s of how testosterone affects behavior and how estrogen affects behavior. We now know, as I mentioned earlier, that genetics shows that every normal female has XX chromosomes in every cell of their body, and every male XY. In short, science has proved decisively that gender is profoundly rooted in your physiology, in your body as male and female. Let's go back and link Money's debunked theory to the gender unicorn image that we looked at. Essentially, what we're looking at is that John Money put this split between gender identity, his theory, and the physical body, your biological sex. That's at the heart of gender theory, and that's at the heart, as I've said before, of this diagram. John Money also changed the term sexual preference to sexual orientation. By doing that, he basically changed sex from being a moral preference to being a kind of a condition that you cannot help. So the result of this gender unicorn diagram as a worldview in our culture is leading many, many children, mostly girls, down a pathway to attempt to change their body to keep up with their idea of their gender, that they are a boy in a girl's body. And that what that path looks like is beginning with gender blockers. We'll talk more about that next time. Then taking cross-gender hormones, then moving on to what's called top surgery, removing the breasts, and then moving on to bottom surgery. So how do we try to put a biblical lens over what we've looked at? Well, the first observation is that the origin of gender theory is that it is a brainchild of very sexually broken people. What is the goal of this ideology? Well, the three primary shapers of gender theory had an agenda, which is very clear when you look at what they wrote. It's the overthrow of sexual norms that would deem their personal sexual activity wrong. We've also noticed a tremendous spreading of gender ideology. How has that happened? Well, part of the reason that has happened is that this delusion contributes to the agenda of the homosexual community. So it's not just the T in LGBTQ, transgender, but it furthers the agenda of the lesbian and gay coalition that is a part of this movement. That effort to minimize the distinction between male and female, making homosexual sex socially more acceptable. And then, of course, the biblical worldview would say that gender theory has been 100% refuted by modern science. Yet, its advocates promote it anyway. And here we need to help our kids understand why that happens. And one of the things we can observe about John Money is that he was a psychologist. So he understood temperaments. He understood that there's an array of temperaments on the female binary of those who are girls. Some are more tomboyish. There's an array of temperaments when it comes to males. Some are more tender, have characteristics that would historically be attributed to females. But what he tried to do was to turn God's glorious creativity to his own purpose, to undermine God's binary creation design of sex between one man and one woman. And we need to help our kids understand why this happened and why there's so many buying into a view of the world that has been totally refuted by science. And it is the fact that human thinking has been corrupted by the fall. Mine has been, yours has been. It goes with the fall. Paul called attention to that so clearly in his letter to the church at Ephesus. You must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. We all suffer from that disease. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. So why is gender theory scientifically thoroughly disproved by science, yet still spreading? Because fallen sinful man suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. Let's continue to put a biblical lens over gender theory for a couple of more moments. Gender dysphoria, when we try to analyze it, is an identity disorder. That's what it was called up until 2012, gender identity disorder. It is a psychosis. It is a disconnect from reality, and we'll see more about that next time. The cause of the growth of, again, this ideology, this view of gender, could be deeply rooted in the philosophy of our age, as Carl Trueman has pointed out, the rise and triumph of the modern self. That truth is relative, and now it's to the point where I make my own truth, and I decide I'm a girl, and so I am a girl. It's sort of the epitome of subjectivism. A final or one more observation is that it fractures personhood. We saw that already, but just to stop and think about that again, it's fracturing people. Gender theory leads to disintegration brokenness, splitting apart of identity, sex, romance, and the physical body. In contrast is the biblical worldview, which is about integration and wholeness and health. And finally, to get to the real root of this, it's an assault upon God. An assault upon God's binary design of mankind as male and female is an assault upon him because he has chosen the union male-female to reflect his image to the world. So, before we close, one more topic. How did gender theory move into the culture's mainstream? First, through higher education. Just a sample, in 2015, more than 2,000 students graduated from U.S. colleges with degrees in women or gender studies. And those people have found their way into personnel offices and a lot of them into the educational system. Secondly, it has spread through an organization called SICUS, the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States, which is a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, dedicated to advancing sexual freedom, especially among children. They are promoting their sex ed material across the country. This ideology is rooted in the teaching of Alfred Keynes and was funded originally by Hugh Hefner. Third, through infiltrating American medical associations. In 2012, a small group of gender theory ideologues at a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association succeeded in getting gender identity disorder changed to gender dysphoria. In the coming 2013 revision of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That is huge. What had been defined as a disorder is now defined as an experience. And it could be the society that's not accepting a transgender child's view of his gender that is causing that confusion. So that's a massive transition. Why did that happen? Because many of those who are at the top of medical associations, not everybody, not even the majority, but many have an agenda that they're promoting. And that agenda, that ideological agenda, can be seen in the fact that these medical organizations all favor allowing children to get an abortion without their parents' consent. And so those, unfortunately, doctors that are shaping the policies of many of these organizations are ideologues first and medical doctors second. Third, through the ideologues' promotion in the social media. There's obviously a direct correlation between the growth of the social media, the growth of cell phone use, and the explosion of particularly rapid onset gender dysphoria, the experience of gender dysphoria in our teenagers. We'll look again more next time at that. Through the embrace of the Democrat Party, the White House Department of Health and Human Services, quote, HHS stands with transgender and gender nonconforming youth in unequivocally stating that gender-affirming care for minors improves their physical and mental health. Attempts to restrict, challenge, or falsely characterize this potentially life-saving care as abuse are dangerous. And finally, through the capitulation of Christians to culture. I personally believe that this started in the 70s with egalitarianism, a rejection of what the scriptures teach about the differences in male and female roles in the home and the church, the family of God. And that has really opened the door and played right into the hands of gender theory ideologues. But within my circles, the circles of complementarianism, I believe that we have failed too in many ways to take a stand and to speak into the culture, because the primary argument of those who hold gender theory is ad hominem abusive. It is to attack the character of those who would challenge their ideology, calling such a person transphobic, homophobic, and so forth. Transgender culture warriors seem to be everywhere. Forces of politics, law, business, entertainment, education, academia, medical association all seem to be arrayed against us. Perhaps we might be compared to the rebellion in Star Wars. We have little institutional political power, less funding and cultural power than the trans ideologues. We certainly are less ruthless and less willing to lie. But we have on our side the Spirit of God and the truth of God. And that Holy Spirit is willing to wield the truth, the sword of the Spirit, and tear down strongholds, arguments, and everything that raises itself up against the knowledge of God. We have the power to help guide those we love into a true, valuable, rich, biblical understanding of God's fabulous design of humankind as male and female.